Okay, thankful again for this opportunity we have to study together, and appreciate very much you taking time to be a part of this effort tonight. We're reading through the Proverbs together and trying to learn its lessons, and tonight we begin with the 12th verse of Proverbs 27. Let's see here. There we go. All right, let's see here. Pardon me a minute, and I'll see if I can make this work. There we go. Verse 12. A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. We coupled with that verse 13. Take his garment that is surety for a stranger, and take a pledge of him for a strange woman. What in the world is that about? And what do these two verses have in common? We'll couple them together. Well, a couple of things, actually. Number one, both of these verses are principles that have been laid out before in the Proverbs in just about the same words. You do have occasionally repeats in the book of Proverbs, and I don't know that that's accidental. I think sometimes the Lord does that for emphasis, but these are a couple of examples of that. You can read these verses back in chapter 22 and in chapter 20. But they have something else in common besides being repetitive. They both deal with maybe one of the most important, one of the most fundamental characteristics of wisdom, and that is foresight. A guy asked me one time, what's the essence of wisdom in the book of Proverbs? And I thought, well, that's a good question. I ought to have a good answer to it. There are several, actually. We remember the passage that says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that's right. Reverence is an essence of wisdom. But I think one of the things that we do read about tied to wisdom repeatedly is the idea of foresight. That wise people are people that don't just think about what's going on right now, but they think about the consequences of their action, of others' actions. They see further than most people are willing to see. And that's, I think, tied to the principles in both of these verses. In verse 12, for example, he talks about a prudent man foresees the evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. One modern speech paraphrase reads, sensible people will see trouble coming and avoid it, but an unthinking person will walk right into it and regret it later. There's something that's just common in foolishness, and that's that inability to see or unwillingness to see the consequences. Matthew Henry years ago wrote that the simple here is either so dull that he does not see or foresee, or so willful and slothful that he won't take care to avoid the trouble. And so he passes on securely and is punished. We do well for ourselves when we provide for hereafter. And that's obviously true. So have the foresight. Learn from other people what's going on, and consider the consequences. If I do this, what will come of it? Sometimes we have to do things that are going to bring trouble on us anyway because they're right. It's demanded that we do that. But we can make life awfully hard when there's no reason to, just because we're not wise enough to plan ahead. Verse 13, I think, is a similar thought. The old King James is a little bit difficult to navigate. It reads, take his garment that is surety for a stranger, and take a pledge of him for a strange woman. Well, again, the modern speech translations reads, take the coat of anyone who puts up security for a stranger, and hold it in pledge if he co-signs for an immoral woman. What's he talking about there? He's talking about the ancient practice of lending money Actually, it still goes on today. People lend money. Sometimes they will take security for a loan. And the idea here is that if you're going to go into business, and that's really what a loan is with someone, if they're so foolish that they are willing to themselves make risky loans, trusting a stranger, someone that they don't know, or someone worse than that who they know to be immoral. If that's the way they handle their business, then they come to you for help. You're just begging for trouble if you get in business with folks like that. I think it was Matthew Henry again who wrote, "Such as these will take up money as far as their credit will go, but they will certainly cheat their creditors at last." This passage advises us to be so discreet in ordering our affairs as not to lend money to those who are manifestly wasting their estates unless they give very good security for it. Foolish lending is an injustice to our families. It's another reminder of how practical the Proverbs are. They are practical. It deals with all kinds of aspects of our lives, including how we handle money. What he says here is that it's foolish of you not to be thoughtful and selective about the business choices that you make. Sometimes people need help, and we just, as an act of mercy, we might help them. We've probably all been on both ends of that. And what he's talking about here is you're going to in effect, go into business with someone. They need money. Now you loan them money. And what happens if they can't repay because of the foolish decisions that they have made and will continue to make? Well, now they're going to default, and what are you going to do? And sometimes people can get in over their heads. They can borrow money or be extended beyond what they're able to repay. And so what he's saying is, don't take on someone else's trouble, risking your own circumstance, because they've never learned how to handle the money that they have. There's a lot in the Proverbs said about debt, a lot said about being a borrower and the slavery that borrowing money involves. But in this passage, he talks about lending money. And he says if you lend money to people who are not able to handle money, and you do so not getting any security, you're just strung out, as it were, for that amount, it's going to come back to bite you. And frankly, he says it's your fault because you should have known better. That has a very modern ring to it to me. The wording might put us off a little bit at first, but I couldn't help, when you read passages like that, you think about very modern cases. I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we had a serious crisis in this country in which a number of banking institutions were maybe going under or had to be helped by the government in some emergency way. I'm no great expert on all of that, but I do remember someone making the point that many of these lending institutions had maybe been encouraged or maybe strong-armed into lending money to people who were not really in a position to be borrowing the money. They were not in a position to pay back the money. And suddenly, but not unexpectedly, when the defaults begin rolling in, all of a sudden the big institutions that you think are too big to fail, now, how are they going to pay their debt? It's the same principle that you find in the Proverbs 3,000 years ago. If you're unwise in who you lend to and how you lend, then that trouble is going to come back on you. So be wise. It's good advice and very practical even today. Let's look at another proverb, if we might, in Proverbs 27 and verse 14. He that blesseth his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, it shall be counted a curse to him. When you read this passage and you read about a fellow blessing his friend, the word bless obviously suggests the idea of to praise, say something good about, to thank, to salute, to wish well. Those are some of the synonyms for this word bless. But the blessing of this fellow turns into a curse. it's counted as a curse. What happens? Well, with a loud voice rising early in the morning, he's full of words, but they're not appreciated because they're ill-timed, and maybe because they come too easily, maybe because they are seen as insincere. One translation reads here, a friend's loud blessing early in the morning will be thought of as a curse, and that seems to be the idea. Mr. Kidner, writing about this passage, said that it reminds us that it matters not only what we say, but how we say it, and when we say it, and why we say it. And so it is. Another fellow wrote that a pretentious, untimely display of friendship must be met with suspicion. Insincerity is a form of profanity. So, it looks like when you first read this verse that this old guy woke somebody up too early. Well, he may have done that. There may be a lot more involved in this as well. But it's simply the idea of someone who, while their words suggest praise and respect, what they say and how they say it, when they say it, ultimately don't show much respect. And it comes across being not a positive but a negative thing. Another fellow writing on this passage says, on the surface it appears to be describing one who comes in early and loud with his blessing or greeting. He's considered a nuisance. And I'm sure that's true. Another fellow wrote, look out for the fellow who professes friendship too loudly, offers too many compliments. Such ostentation is offensive. The man who takes overblown compliments at face value is foolish. There are people who, by the way they even offer praise, make you wonder, what do they really want? What is their real motive? And it's a part of wisdom to recognize that. And I think also in our passage, what he's saying is, don't be that kind of person. Don't be the kind of person who says what he doesn't really mean, who speaks just for effect, because such will be recognized. Most people are not going to be that foolish. The loud voice, the rising early, denotes an inopportune and tactless insistency, which cannot wait for a convenient opportunity to do expression. It shall be counted a curse to him. The receiver of this sordid adulation would just as soon be cursed by the parasite as blessed in this offensive manner. This clamorous outpouring of gratitude is not accepted as a return by the benefactor. He sees the mean motives by which it is dictated self-interest and hope of the future benefits, he says. And he holds cheap as he would the curses of such a person. It's not appreciated. Mr. Barnes says simply, the picture here is of ostentatious flatterer going at daybreak to pour out blessings on his patron. For any good that he does, for any thanks that he gets, he might as well be uttering curses. So, mean what you say. And if we're truly thankful for other people, then be sincere in our expression of it. And by all means, be thoughtful. One word of thoughtful, sincere praise is worth 10,000 words of empty flattery. And that's a good reminder from the Proverbs here. Let's look at another passage, this time in verse 15, and couple with that verse 16. A continual dropping in a very rainy day and a contentious woman are alike. Whosoever hideth her hideth the wind, and the ointment of his right hand which bewrayeth itself. What's all that talking about? Well, in the first place, he's talking about how that some people have an attitude that is extremely displeasing and destructive. It's a sad picture, really, of, in this case, a woman. I assume a wife is what he has in mind here. who is contentious. That's a word which is otherwise translated quarreling, discord, strife given, brawling. This is a term that we find a number of times, this term midyon in the Proverbs. I'll read just one with you. Back over in the 26th chapter of Proverbs, we looked at this earlier. In verse 20, the wise man wrote, "Where no wood is, there the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. As coals are to burning coals, and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife." You see how that strife is parallel with fire, and that's a pretty graphic picture. That's what this is. It's just an attitude that burns, that consumes, that's painful, that destroys. That's the contentious person. That's why some of the modern speech translators offer substitutes like a bitter-tongued woman, or a nagging woman, or a quarrelsome woman. By the way, I don't think that this passage is indicating that it can't go the other direction. Sometimes with men, the nagging part may not be as common as some other type of ungodly and destructive behavior. I think what's the modern term now? We talk about passive aggressive, and maybe men have more of a tendency that way to be people who sulk or shut down, or sometimes in even worse form, they might be physically violent or abusive or something like that. But in so many cases through the years, if a woman in a relationship has a bad spirit, that she might vent her frustrations with angry words, a quarrelsome, contentious, bickering spirit. Whichever way that goes, it's no fun to be in a relationship, to be in a marriage relationship, for example, with someone who is given over to that. In the latter part of the passage, he points out you just can't hide that. To hide, to restrain. I think ESV says to restrain her is to restrain the wind, or to grasp oil in one's right hand. So he talks about how bad it is to be in a relationship with someone who is a contentious, bitter person. And then particularly if it's the wife that we have in mind here, how difficult that is ultimately to hide that. About like trying to reach down and pick up a handful of oil, or to restrain the wind. So there's the picture for us. I like what one fellow wrote about this passage, and again, we find a number like this in the Proverbs, don't we? He said it reflects the sage's view of marriage. Nothing's better than a good one, and nothing worse than a bad one. There's a lot of truth in that. And so this is a bad one. A quarrelsome wife is like the dripping of a leaky roof in a rainstorm. Somebody made the point that, Mr. Garrett wrote, a contentious woman is like the aggravation of a steady drip. She destroys the social and financial well-being of the home. Another wrote, it's a grievance that there's no avoiding. It's like a continual dripping in a very rainy day. Henry makes the point, he said, you might have a fuss with your neighbor, but you get away from that. But if it's in your home, the contentions of a neighbor may be like a sharp shower, he wrote, troublesome for a time, and yet while it lasts, one can take shelter. But he said the contentions of a wife are like a constant soaking rain from which there's no remedy but patience. When you've got trouble in your own home, you have trouble. And this passage, I think, is not trying to deal with every aspect of this. Now, there are a lot of things that we might think of when we read a passage like this, taking it face value. How did this woman get this way? Did you just choose to marry a contentious woman? If so, that's a poor choice on your part. Or has there been some behavior on the part of the man that has, through the years, driven her to the hopelessness and bitterness that she finds herself in? All those are questions beyond our passage. They're all important questions. But here we simply have the problem. And the problem is a man is married to a woman, or a man has a woman there in the house there. I say it could be a mother, could be someone else, but I think it's generally taken to be a husband-wife relationship. And her attitude is just destructive, and it ruins the spirit, and it's unhideable. He says, wise man would hide it if he could, for his sake and for his wife's sake too, but she won't let him. He can't any more do it than he could conceal the noise of the wind when it blows, or he says the smell of some fragrant perfume on his hands. Those that are froward and brawling will proclaim their own shame even when their friends in kindness to them would cover. And so it is. At least a leaky roof can be plugged up, but as well try to put the wind in wraps or pick up a handful of oil as to try to tame the shrew, Mr. Atkins wrote. Another fellow said, this woman would only raise her voice the louder if she thought that her husband was anxious for others not to hear her. That's a really powerful picture, isn't it, of somebody who is just, they are just beyond caring about what's right. They have just let bitterness absolutely control them and let it flow in their words and their thinking and their actions. It's a very tragic picture. Mr. Alden reminds us that the only way to deal with her is to remove oneself from her until she cools down. And that might be the thought behind those passages we read back in the 21st chapter. And in verse 9, for example, it's better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Or verse 19, it's better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. But you know, whichever way this goes, whether it be the angry and contentious woman or whether it be the angry man, going away until they cool down might be a good start, but it's not going to solve the problem, is it? There are other things that need to be done. There's some genuine communication and genuine self-examination that needs to be done. The problem is we can only control ourselves. But this passage is just reminding us of a problem that's all too common in the world in which we live, and that is too much temper, not enough listening, not enough patience, not enough love. That being the case, the result is always just more and more unhappiness. The true answer to these problems is repentance, but he's just telling us it's a terrible place to go. And if we have any shred of ability to listen to the will of God, we ought to realize this is a dead-end road, letting your bitterness flow. It might make you feel better for a minute, but I promise you, it's just digging the hole deeper and deeper. Okay, let's spend a minute looking at verse 17. In 27:17, iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. Iron sharpens iron. I guess we think of the Iron Age as coming a little bit later than the time of the Proverbs, but men have been using iron for a long time, and they certainly were well aware of iron and did use it to some extent. So you have an iron implement, maybe it's an axe or something of that nature, and so it's sharpened so that it might be more useful, better adapted to its given purpose and service. He makes the comparison between sharpening your tools and the idea of two people who would sharpen each other, friends in this case, who would sharpen one another. Sharpen the countenance. That word countenance, the old King James word, literally means face. And sometimes it's used in reference to the whole person, sometimes to their attitude, sometimes to their emotions, if that's something different. Um, some of the modern speech translations read, sharpens the wits of another, or sharpens a friend's character. What he's pointing to is something I think we all realize, and that is that just as surely as you have to sharpen iron against other iron, people are made better by what one fellow called stimulating contact, constructive friendships, in which there's genuine sharing and communication and testing of one another's beliefs. Can be of great value. Cambridge Bible noted, this has been understood to mean exasperates. There is a sense in which sharpen can be a negative thing, but not here. Here we have actions between not enemies, but friends. So I think we're right in saying that this is something that is a positive, intended to be a positive. The sharpening that two people can affect that they can have on one another. Mr. Aitken writes, a man's character and wits do not develop in a cocoon, but by interaction with others. Good conversation, the exchange of views, healthy disagreements, and the like are necessary to sharpen the mind and shape the character. And that's exactly right. Somebody made the point of comparing this with all kinds of things, whether it be scholars, artists, athletes. They sharpen each other by competition, exchange of ideas, and constructive criticism. And we know that's true. These days, of course, this is a very unusual circumstance now as far as athletics is concerned. But we have usually in this off season for sports, for fall sports, before there can be organized practices and so on, it's not unusual to hear about athletes going out and practicing in small groups, just getting together and throwing and catching or whatever they're doing to practice with each other. Why? Because there's a value in that idea of not just working out by yourself, but the motivation and the encouragement and the fellowship that can make that time even more productive. Well, that's certainly true when it comes to other pursuits. For example, in Bible study, when people who simply love God and put spiritual things first, when they can associate with one another, I think it cannot but help us, make us stronger, make us wiser. It's a time when we might discuss our attitudes and we might find room for improvement. This is purposeful. It's one of the reasons why I think in a passage like Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25, where the Hebrew writer said, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. One of the reasons why God set up the church assembly, that is his idea, by the way, not something that men have invented, but when people come together truly in his name, there's a strength and a sharpening you get from that kind of environment that, frankly, we're not going to get if we're just by ourselves. What the fellow wrote here, we're not made to just grow in a cocoon. We're made to sharpen one another. Now, that can go the other way. As one fellow noted, he reminds us of that principle that evil companionships corrupt good morals. And that's true. Hanging around the wrong crowd or those who are misguided or whose priorities are totally out of whack, they can discourage, they can pull us down, they can maybe confuse things that ought to be clear in our minds. But in a positive way, we really can help each other and should help each other. I mentioned here on the chart about one of the great things that young people can do. And if any young folks are watching this, I hope you take this personally. I know in our case, as our daughters were growing up, I'm so grateful for young people that were just a few years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years older than they were, who took the time with them to be a friend to them, to communicate with them, to encourage them, to show them the way. I believe in mentorship. I really do. And I think it's one of the most important things. Sometimes young people might feel like, well, that it's somebody else's job to lead. It's your job to lead. All of us can have a good influence on other people. Find somebody that needs a friend, be a friend. You can sharpen. And you might find that you're gaining a lot in return as well. So iron sharpens iron. And that principle is one that I think ought to not only remind us, it ought to motivate us to be a help to others. Let's look at another one if we might. This time verse 18. Whoso keepeth the fig tree shall eat the fruit thereof, so he that waiteth on his master shall be honored. You have somebody keeping a fig tree and somebody waiting on his master. Those are two words that jump out at us. The word keep there might be translated to guard, to protect, to maintain. And so we have someone keeping a fig tree and being devoted to its betterment. And in the same way, he talks about someone who regards or takes care or preserves a master. People sometimes get all bent out of shape about the idea of servants and masters in the Bible and so on. He's not in anywhere in the scriptures condoning the idea of kidnapping somebody and holding them against their will. That's not ever considered to be righteous behavior, certainly in the teaching of Christ. But the truth is that even today, we all find ourselves serving somebody. And they are those that are above us in some way, to whom we owe service. And so in the scriptures, we have a number of reminders that say, how are you going to deal with these types of things in life? Well, what you ought to do is you ought to take the responsibilities that you have and to serve others as you would serve Christ. A modern speech translation of our passage is, take care of a tree and you'll eat its fruits. Look after your master and you'll be praised. Someone that serves faithfully, prudently, diligently is someone the Lord says will be blessed. Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6, in the Roman world there were a lot of servants, and some of them had obeyed the gospel. So what should they do? Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, serving as unto Christ, I should say. Not with eye service as men pleasers, not just doing the right thing when somebody's watching, in other words, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. That the Lord doesn't care all that much whether I'm a servant or a master. What he does care about is that I treat one another right, that I take responsibility seriously, and that I'm honorable in the way that I deal with the responsibilities I'm given. By the way, in verse 9, he talks to those who have the authority. And he says, forbearing threatening. Don't you dare threaten. He says, knowing that your master is also in heaven. Neither is there any respect of persons with him. So, there's a great deal said about servitude in the scriptures, Old and New Testament. What we're called on to do is to be faithful to that calling. Just like a fig tree requires constant care but yields an abundant crop, so the ministrations of faithful servants will not be without their due reward. Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 is talking about, in this passage to Timothy, about his serving as a teacher of the gospel. And he makes a couple of comparisons, you remember. He talks about how that we are, as teachers of the gospel, like a good soldier in some ways. And we're called to be faithful and to endure hardship. He says, like a husbandman. And he makes this point. He says, the husbandman, that is the farmer, that labors must be first partakers of the fruits. there's a gain that we have, as a blessing we receive from being a hard worker, being diligent, being faithful, being consistent as a steward. Diligence secures a reward even for a humble servant. You know, you talk about people being mistreated or folks in bad situations. If you know the story of Joseph, and I know you do, in Genesis chapter 39, now Joseph was not a voluntary slave or servant. He was sold by his brothers into slavery, then wound up in a prison. But in both places, the thing that's so striking is that wherever he was, he followed the rules of godliness and honesty and hard work, and God blessed him where he was. If there was ever an example of a man who bloomed where he was planted, it was Joseph. And that spirit is the same spirit that I think consistently God calls on us to have. You know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 makes the point that if we can be free, let's be free. But even if we're free, we're Christ's servant. And in whatever situation we are, we can always do right, whether it's in service or in freedom. Now that principle is one that I need to take to heart. Henry notes this is designed to encourage diligence, faithfulness, and constancy, even in mean, low employment. Though the calling be laborious and despicable, yet those who keep to it will find there's something to be got by. You know, that's not popular in the world in which we live, and it's certainly not common. I think all of us have lamented the fact that we've raised generations of young people who think they ought to start at the top and work their way up. You know, the idea of starting at the bottom or having to pay your dues or all those, that's just old-fashioned thinking. The idea of getting into a job and sticking with it, and that's for the birds. We go from place to place to place. And, well, again, there may be a reason why you change jobs. Now, I'm not here to say you ought never change jobs. My point is that the idea that that there ought to never be any time when we have to pay our dues is just is nonsense. Ultimately, it's not sustainable. Another point that I thought of along this line, I think our passage would be broad enough to remind us of the principle that there's a value and an honor in being a company man. Whoso keeps the fig tree shall eat the fruit thereof. He that waits on his master shall be honored. You know, a lot of people have some negative things to say about I guess they would sneeringly call the Dudley Do-Right, you know, who comes in there and works hard, you know, and is respectful, and, well, oh, that guy's, you know, he's just, well, there are all kind of terms that people use, and most of them are too crude to use. But this idea of some sycophant who's just there to show everybody up. You know, I wish we could communicate this lesson to our children and have them believe it, and I wish others would share it as well. There's an essence to being a company man, because if a company doesn't have enough company men, there's no company. As we might eloquently put it, when it comes to the idea of farming and so on, working with fruit trees. If you don't tend the tree, you don't have a tree. If you don't have a tree, you don't have fruit. You don't have a fruit, you don't eat. It all comes back to us. I know small business owners struggle to find people to work at the entry level. And they may be doing what seem to be menial jobs. They won't be there forever, but while they're there, we need somebody who can just sweep the floor well. And the guy who's hired to sweep the floor, you know, he feels like he's too good to do the job, so he doesn't do the job. And it just never occurs to him, okay, if the floors are dirty, then when people come in here and they see a dirty floor, they say, at a restaurant, let's say, I don't want to come back here. If they don't come back, the guy doesn't make money. If he doesn't make money, I can't get paid. It's all interconnected. That's what this proverb is saying. There's a connection. And if we don't tend to our business, then ultimately we're going to suffer for it as well as others. So, I like what one fellow put it. He said, "The unsuccessful servant may affect to despise honor." I didn't want it anyway. But the fellow that he calls the favorite, or the teacher's pet, or whatever it might be, are sometimes that's nothing more than the half-hearted criticizing the wholehearted, and I think that's about the way it is. He says the wise man said, wisdom dictates that we bring our whole heart to whatever job, whether it be high or low, simple or complex. Be effective as a servant. Do the best you can at what you do. And there's a blessing for you in that, as well as being a blessing to others. Mr. Alden wrote, "The lesson here is literal as well as symbolic. Anything we prune, cultivate, work hard at will yield benefits as well as win praise." I'm not sure if it's too late or not. I hate to be pessimistic. I don't know if we can turn that around or not. I know there's some young people who are as hardworking and conscientious as they come, as anybody's ever been. But they seem to be more in the minority than they've ever been. So all we can do is to try to show a good example, teach our children a good example, influence all that we can. You know, that God calls us to service, that there's an honor in work and in doing work well, whatever that work might be. If it's moral and righteous, let us take pride in what we do and be a blessing to others. Of course, the ultimate, I think, application of this is that we're all servants of God, and we're called to be servants. You know, when the Lord told that very familiar story in Matthew 25 about the parable of the talents, as we call it, in verse 21 of that passage, the Lord said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things." You know, in the workplace, you're looking to promote people that will take what you give them and do well with it. And then you can give them more and give them more because they gain trust. The ultimate example of that is the Lord gives us a charge to use our abilities that we've been given for His service. And He says, "I will reward you for that." There's a blessing that comes with the faithful service. One more passage from the book of John. In John, the 12th chapter, the context here, you know, there are some people who had come saying, "Sir, we would see Jesus." And the Lord said in verse 23 that His hour was come that the Son of Man should be glorified. This is just before He would be arrested and crucified. And He pointed out how that, a plant doesn't live until it dies. In other words, you put the seed into the ground, but from that seed that sacrifices itself, the plant comes, and that's the work that He would do. And that's what He calls on us to do. "He that loves his life," verse 25, "shall lose it, and he that hates his life in this world shall keep it unto eternal life." Then verse 26, "If any man serve me, let him follow me. And where I am, there also my servant shall be. And if any man serve me, him will my Father honor." Greatest example of this principle is if you give God your life in your service, you certainly won't regret it. There's a lot about service in the Bible, serving men, but ultimately and always serving God. If we're too proud to serve, and if that just makes us bristle up, we don't serve anybody, we're going to have a hard time going to heaven, frankly, because that's what we're called to be. We're called to be servants. I appreciate your kind attention. I appreciate you listening, and I hope that we'll be able, Lord willing, to be together again.